Sir, your loved one has approximately a 1% chance of living. Wow. Okay, that is a direct quote. It's a stark, frankly pretty grim medical metaphor used recently by Donald Trump, but he isn't talking about a person at all here. No, that is his diagnosis of the current U.S.-Iran ceasefire and diplomatic negotiations. I mean, when the doctor walks into the room and gives you those kinds of odds, you know you're in an incredibly dire situation, right? Well, let's really dive into this, because right now, diplomatic efforts between Washington and Tehran aren't just stalling out. They're literally on life support, staring down a total collapse.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a rapidly unfolding and honestly massively complex crisis that's spreading across the Gulf. We're taking the absolute latest intelligence, the very public statements, and the geopolitical hard data from both sides of this conflict to figure out exactly what's going on. Because the situation is escalating daily. We're talking everything from intense military encounters out at sea to absolute defiance at the negotiating table, and even the very real looming shadow of nuclear thresholds being crossed. So, here is our roadmap for today. 1. The Strait of Hormuz standoff. 2. Crossing the nuclear threshold. 3. A collision of demands. And 4. The global ripple effect. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The Strait of Hormuz standoff.
Now, the waters of the Middle East have always been a bit of a powder keg, But the sheer physical proximity of these two military powers is pushing tensions to an absolute breaking point. According to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Navy, the IRGC, Iranian forces are aggressively monitoring all military movements across the Gulf. They're determined to prevent any violation of their territorial waters. In fact, the IRGC Navy recently made a huge claim. They said a United States warship was actually forced to completely alter its course after getting a direct, face-to-face warning from Iranian forces right there inside the Strait of Hormuz. Now, to be totally fair, it's important to note that Iran hasn't released any actual footage of this encounter, and the U.S. Navy, well, they haven't publicly confirmed this claim at all. But honestly, the timing of this assertion matters deeply. It sets a really volatile baseline, because while tensions are definitely rising on the water, the stakes back on land are escalating even faster.
Which brings us to Part 2, Crossing the Nuclear Threshold. 400 kilograms. Just let that number sink in for a second. Before this recent 10-week conflict really kicked into high gear, international monitors believe that Iran already held roughly 400 kilograms of uranium that was enriched to around 60% purity. Now, what you need to know is that in the world of nuclear physics, getting to that 60% mark, that requires the vast majority of the time, the money, and the effort. From 60% reaching the ultimate red line of weapons-grade material is just a very, very short technical jump. And right now, today, the exact fate and status of that massive stockpile remains alarmingly unclear. And that brings us to this incredibly stark figure, 90%. As the military pressure mounts, the rhetoric coming out of Tehran is getting visibly sharper. Iranian parliament spokesman Ibrahim Razi recently issued a very public, very clear warning. He flat out stated that one of Iran's immediate options, if there's another military attack, could be enriching their uranium all the way up to 90%. He even noted they would formally review this option in parliament. Amidst these failing ceasefire talks, this is without a doubt one of the clearest and most definitive nuclear warnings we've seen from Tehran to date.
So just to make sure we're all entirely on the same page about what that actually means, weapons-grade uranium is uranium enriched to 90% or higher. This marks the exact technical threshold required to build a nuclear weapon, period. So when Iranian officials threaten to jump from 60% to 90%, they aren't talking about civilian energy programs anymore, right? They're explicitly putting the capability to develop a nuclear weapon right there on the table as a deterrent against any further strikes. It makes this highly technical leap incredibly concrete and terrifyingly urgent.
Okay, so how is Washington viewing this threat? Well, U.S. intelligence assessments reportedly conclude that Iran's nuclear program can really only be meaningfully degraded through three very specific, highly physical actions. 1. Remove the highly enriched stockpile from the country entirely. 2. Chemically neutralize the material. Or 3. Physically destroy the nuclear facilities. There's just no middle ground in the American intelligence view. And as you can probably guess, demanding the total dismantling of another nation's nuclear infrastructure, yeah, that requires some incredibly complex diplomacy.
And that leads us straight into Part 3, a collision of demands.
Over at the negotiating table, we're looking at a complete, absolute deadlock. And it's based on two fundamentally incompatible timelines. On one hand, you have Washington. They want immediate restrictions, immediate stockpile removal, and an absolute end to domestic enrichment right now. But on the other hand, Tehran is insisting that nuclear issues should only be discussed after the war formally ends and after all economic sanctions are totally lifted. Basically, the US is saying disarmament first and Iran is saying relief first. It's the ultimate staring contest.
And this massive gap in expectations, well, it led to this explosive reaction from Donald Trump regarding Iran's latest negotiating proposal. He said, "I would call it the weakest right now after reading the piece of garbage they sent us." He actually noted that he didn't even finish reading it because it felt like a complete waste of time. From the American perspective here, Iranian officials are just attempting to dictate terms. They're demanding unilateral concessions rather than actually engaging in what the US considers a fair two-way negotiation.
So what exactly was in that proposal that provoked such a visceral response? According to reports on Iranian state television, Tehran, who were communicating through Pakistani mediators, laid out a strictly uncompromising set of conditions for peace. Here's what they want. They're demanding massive war reparations from the United States, complete sovereignty and control over the Strait of Hormuz, the total removal of all those economic sanctions currently strangling their economy, the return of billions in seized Iranian assets, and an immediate lifting of the naval blockade in the Gulf, along with a total halt to all future military strikes. Now, Iranian spokesperson Ismail Baghai, he insists these aren't excessive at all. From Tehran's viewpoint, these conditions are just strictly rooted in defending their national sovereignty and reacting to the massive regional instability caused by years of Western sanctions and military coercion.
And the leadership in Tehran? They are doubling down on this posture hard. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian explicitly stated, "We will never bow down to the enemy." He vowed that Tehran will continue defending its national interests with absolute strength. The message here is unmistakable, guys. Iran is stating loud and clear they will not negotiate from a position of weakness, they absolutely won't surrender under a pressure campaign, and they are completely prepared for a broader confrontation if diplomacy completely falls apart.
But there's another massive player in this region watching these stalled talks incredibly closely. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently weighed in with a pretty stark warning of his own. He stated there is, quote, more work to be done against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. We're impartially laying out all the perspectives here, and Israel's stance, it adds a massive, very real layer of regional military threat hanging directly over these already fragile negotiations. Because if the diplomats fail, the military options from both the US and its allies remain fully 100% on the table.
Let's pull back and look at the big picture in Part 4, the global ripple effect.
When we zoom out to the macro level to look at all these cascading consequences, the shockwaves of this 10-week conflict are basically instantaneous. We saw an immediate surge in global oil prices the literal moment talks collapsed. There is severe, ongoing pressure right now on shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the world's absolute most critical oil arteries, and Iran is openly using that as strategic leverage. This naturally creates a huge risk of deep financial market instability worldwide. And militarily, even during brief periods of supposed calm, hostile drones have been detected flying right over Gulf states, which just underlines the sheer, unpredictable volatility of the region. Why does this matter? Because a localized tension in the Middle East translates directly to the prices at your gas pump and to the global supply chains we all rely on.
And honestly, the timing of this deadlock, it literally couldn't be more complex. This deep diplomatic freeze threatens even deeper instability, exactly as Trump prepares for a massively high-stakes visit to China. The world is already facing immense economic anxiety. Having a festering, totally unresolved crisis over the Strait of Hormuz, crippling global sanctions, and a looming uranium enrichment threat, all happening at the exact same time as major US-China diplomatic movements, it creates a highly unpredictable global geopolitical environment. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces are moving at once.
Which brings us to a final, absolutely critical question. With diplomacy essentially on life support right now, and both sides, the United States and Iran, just deeply entrenched in their uncompromising demands, what's going to be the breaking point that decides the future of the Middle East? Will it be a sudden military miscalculation in the Gulf? A sudden overnight leap to 90% nuclear enrichment? Or maybe, just maybe, an unexpected diplomatic breakthrough? The region's future is incredibly fragile right now, and the entire world is holding its breath, waiting to see who blinks first. Thank you so much for joining